Well, I don't want to forget this one. I've talked about it before. My weird theory of what I call psychological systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So there is something called SEERS, systemic or systematic, I can't remember. SIRS, systemic inflammatory response syndrome. And then I mentioned recently the University of Texas that proved that brain trauma didn't just cause, what we know, the risk of CTE later in life, but they found that it caused systemic inflammation. And so I'm just coming off of a weird experience. Myself having a rare autoinflammatory disease, it's kind of definition defying. It has symptoms of both autoinflammatory and autoimmune. And it's funny because when someone used to ask me about the disease, and there wasn't very often, and they weren't, say, a doctor or a scientist, I would mention lupus, right? Get an idea. It's similar to lupus. And so I went to the hospital one time because I had a golf ball size abscess, which was just originally a bunch of sebum that builds up and then blood. And it's just a cascade, if you will. So I had to have it drained. It was, softball sized in my hip. That was bad enough, but at the time, certain spots around my hip, if it got bad enough, inflammatory-wise, it would cause my hip to become inflamed, right? So I just assumed it was collateral damage from the inflammation. And so the hip inflamed and I lost movement. And then that would happen with very little other interaction, but I didn't connect the two. I just assumed it was some sort of cascade reaction, as I said before. Right? I had most of the HS in control, yet I would still have these bouts where my hips, and this is what I'm telegraphing a bit here, that was the one hip, and then it developed into, it would alternate sometimes. And then this past week, kind of a tragedy of errors. Had an incredibly stressful week. The following 2 weeks after that stressful week, I've been managing my HS quite well. So not a thing HS related to point out per se. But I developed what could, I guess, be considered kind of like a rheumatoid arthritis symptoms. And recently I realized it's also the symptoms of lupus. This idea of systemic inflammation that causes joints. And I wrote this down just recently that I thought the mistake with rheumatoid arthritis wasn't so much the inflammation causing the damage, but the fact that you lack your movement in your hips. And I was lucky enough, the past week or two, I've been able to not really move all that much because I have a spouse that takes care of me in these situations. I'm blessed that way. And because of that, I've been able to allow some of my major sites to heal. But most importantly here, I haven't pushed the hip. But this is the worst I've ever experienced. It was 2 weeks, one hip, then both, then one hip and back to the other and both. So here I am running around trying to figure out, well, what the heck would cause just straight up inflammatory response? So I was looking at rheumatoid arthritis, but for me, it's only in certain areas. I'll get arthritis in my toes, my ankles, my feet. But this experience I have doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel strictly like arthritis. But this was the worst I've ever had because it was so bad, it was making me wonder what was going on with my entire legs because the pain radiated from my hips down to my legs. And it wasn't one of those circuit-breaking chronic pains that, you just shut off and you become numb. No, it was right at that midpoint where it was, annoying enough to be, crappy, but not so much that it shuts off the body's circuit breaker from pain. So, you go through a few days without sleeping because you can't sleep, the pain. I've talked about this before. Fatigue can make pain perception worse. Pain can make the fatigue, vice versa. They build upon themselves, right? Recursive, kind of like the self. But after this 2 weeks, I'm trying to figure out what could this be. Is it rheumatoid arthritis? Is it something separate? Or, as I was starting to wonder, could it be HS? Right? Could HS be more complicated than just what we think it is? Strictly the sebasides, because we have mood disorder, we have systemic pain, chronic pain, and inflammation, but we just don't talk that much about it because, again, rare. I remember lupus 30, 40 years ago. It was the bleeding edge, and all these poor people suffered because they didn't know what it was and they didn't figure it out. And arguably, don't think much has changed because fast forward to today, the first day I've been feeling clear enough to really put some thoughts together besides just a couple little notes jotted down. That's 2 weeks I've lost. Not unlike Nietzsche, who in fits and spurts produced his greatest work. I thank gosh that I'm nowhere near as bad as he was. But that was 2 weeks down. And today, the first day when I'm able to actually think, lo and behold, Australia is looking to get some authorization for a drug specifically designed for patients with lupus. And how did they describe lupus? Well, exactly what I was saying. Something inflammatory, a transitory inflammatory condition that causes joints and pain and all this. And the poor lady who was being interviewed actually looked just like me. I guess she was having issues with her hips, or her hips were permanently damaged, but she walks around hobbled like me, right? When I have this systemic inflammation. So I half wonder if lupus is just a catch-all that they may have given to some of these inflammatory, but that's down a different road. The plain, simple takeaway here is it looks like I was right about this too. That, I mean, you can change the name if you'd like, but between the study out of the University of Texas that shows that there is a systemic inflammatory response from the trauma, head trauma, and if I compare trauma, psychological trauma, and even something like Carl Friston's free energy, the idea of surprise. His idea of surprise is no different from this idea of trauma, stress, disease, right? That leads to inflammation, which leads to disease. So I argue that I'm not wrong. I may not have the right term, right? Psychological systemic inflammatory response syndrome. But that might be, I've mentioned this for a couple of years now, that inflammation might be the root of the majority of what ails us. Jung might have been wrong. Might not have been being unconscious, but a combination of being both unconscious and inflamed. I kid. But this idea that inflammation, I've said for a couple of years now, trauma, are the next major thing that we need to tackle. We've looked at, immune disease. We've looked at stress. But when you all start to put it together, that gestalt that I tend to talk about, that's what it means. I mean, if we understand that we're more than our component parts, we produce something much more than we could ever predict. Kind of a Hofstadter equation here, the idea that we produce far more than we could ever, and it's not really, but we produce far more than we could ever predict from our component parts, right? If you have, a family that marries and they produce children, you can get a sense of what might come of that pairing. But the human will always surprise, right? That's the idea of gestalt, right? Not just we're more than the sum of our parts, but we're blindingly more, exceedingly more, exponentially more. But that begs the question, if we understand that we are more than our component parts, right? If you break us down, we're nothing but a puddle. Put us back together and we can produce potential, limitless potential. Why do we not see that as a truth, right? Why do we always discount us? But that's my takeaway. Because that, again, is Carl Friston's surprise, right? That's the problem of self. It's the problem of stress, disease, and inflammation. When stuff doesn't go the way you want them to go, or the way you expect them to go, or the way you hope them to go, it causes dis-ease. That surprise can lead to stress if you don't accept it. That stress can lead to inflammation. That inflammation can lead to disease. So arguably, there you go again, the importance of language, right? Disease is not something that insurmountable. You just have to return to a balance. Find your ease.